The immune system, unlike most other units in the vertebrate physiology, we are pretty much going to spend time on the human immune system, mainly because we don't really understand, they haven't been fleshed out, other immune systems, although they're pretty much considered to be the same. There are three steps basically to immunity. There's reconnaissance, which means you look around. If you think about trying to keep invaders out of our country, you have to be able to watch for them. You have to recognize them when they show up, and then you have to respond to them. I kind of talk about immunity like a war. And in a war, you have to be able to, you have to watch, recognize, and respond. Okay, there are two major kinds of defense: innate immunity, genetic, and acquired immunity. And it's the acquired immunity that we're going to spend the most time on. Innate immunity. Innate immunity is things that you have from birth. For example, you have external defenses like your skin, mucous membranes, glandular secretions that help, like earwax and tear ducts and things like that, that help flush out things that might get in. You have internal defenses such as phagocytic cells, which are white blood cells, which can eat a particle with endocytosis. We've talked about that before. You have something called the inflammatory response, which we'll come back to. You have cells called natural killer cells, which wander around the body looking for foreign particles and kill them. You have proteins that have antimicrobial properties. All those are present from birth. The things that, quote, make you sick are microscopic organisms, sometimes not necessarily bacteria. Remember, the things that cause disease: bacteria, viruses, some kinds of fungi, okay, some kinds of protists. Bacteria and viruses. Bacteria cause disease, but remember, by producing something called an exo or endotoxin. But once the bacteria is in you, they produce their toxins. Viruses, remember, take over cells. And so these things that get into your body, they have to be taken care of one at a time. Okay, if you have a certain virus or a certain bacteria that you haven't seen before, you have to take care of them one at a time. And there are two ways to do that, which we'll talk about. One really important part of your immune system is actually the circulatory system in you called the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is an open circulatory system consisting of various lymphatic vessels scattered throughout the body, and then concentrated areas of things called lymph nodes. And so what these do is they pick up stuff out of the interstitial fluid. It's absorbed by capillary action into these, and as your muscles contract and things like that, it's squeezed along into lymph nodes. In lymph nodes, you have white blood cells that help take care of the stuff that comes in here. And then as those things are taken care of, there's a constant movement of this stuff up the body in a major lymphatic organ, and then it's dumped into either the superior vena cava or into the pulmonary artery for disposal. So all around your body, you have a giant lymph node called the spleen, which is in charge of taking care of red blood cells. But generally, the lymphatic system is to pick up stuff, anything that's outside of cells, and get rid of it. Now, another part of your, this is a diagram from your textbook of something called the inflammatory response. You may have seen that mentioned earlier. In the inflammatory response, it's something that happens when your skin is damaged or cellular damage occurs. When cellular damage occurs, okay, and in this case, bacteria, pathogens, the term for something that makes you sick is a pathogen, gets in, chemical signals are sent from something called macrophages, are white blood cells. They digest the bacteria and send out chemical signals. Those chemical signals tell the blood to release white blood cells. They attract white blood cells to the area, and they also release fluid into the area. And the other thing that'll happen is because of the increase in blood flow, it'll get hot and it'll get red. And we call that the inflammatory response. It's a reaction to tissue damage. You've probably experienced it if you've ever sprained an ankle. So in acquired immunity, lymphocytes. Lymphocyte is a white blood cell. Okay? White blood cells provide specific defense against infection. And this is what we want to talk about. Okay, a couple of terms. Something called an antigen is a foreign molecule that is recognized by white blood cells and elicits a response from them. So for example, here's a cell. On the surface of the cell are things, carbohydrates called antigens. You have your own antigens in your body, and another cell from somewhere else will have a different kind of antigen. Your white blood cells recognize different kinds of antigens. Different kind of antigen equals destroy. Now the other slides now are going to talk about the different kinds of responses we have. So here's a example of what happens. Here's the cell. The whole thing is called an antigen. This cell might have 3 different kinds of antigens on its surface. Okay, you could produce 3 possible different kinds of things called antibodies against that antigen. Okay, people get these terms confused. Antibodies are actually good things for you. They get rid of foreign particles. There are 2 main types of white blood cells, B cells and T cells. And it's these that we want to talk about. Okay? B cells and T cells have identical antigen receptors on them to recognize foreign particles. So a B cell and a T cell will have these things on their surface to recognize foreign particles. Okay, and you don't have to know heavy chain and light chain and all that. That's not really that important for this. So what you need to know is that when a cell gets infected with a virus, it produces molecules called MHC molecules, major histocompatibility complex, not that important. But what they do is they take these, when they're infected with a virus, so this cell has a virus inside of it making new viruses. It will put on its surface an MHC molecule which has the antigen on it from the virus. So a cell nearby can find the antigen fragment. It would be rather like if your house was if we were invaded by Canadians and you decide that you are going to put a sign out on your house that says Canadians are in here, that the Canadians can't recognize. That's what's going on. So here's an infected cell. It posts on its surface an antigen fragment on something called an MHC molecule. You don't need to know the different classes. Okay? Some microscopic organisms have the same thing. So notice the foreign antigen is displayed on the surface. It says, hey, come take care of me. There are 2 places cells are made. B cells are made in the bone marrow. T cells are made in the thymus gland. And the thymus gland is actually part of the lymphatic system. So these B cells and T cells then, when they're made, they get put into the blood, lymph, and lymphoid tissues like lymph nodes and spleen. So they're produced in either the bone marrow or in the thymus gland. All right, so how does your body recognize a certain disease? Certain disease. How does your body know, quote, you've had this before? And how does it know to get rid of, say, chicken pox? Well, what happens when you get infected is you get permanent gene rearrangement. In other words, the genes that encode for those little antibody receptors, the genes that encode for these on a B cell or T cell get changed permanently. So what happens is this end that's going to grab on to a virus, it's going to attack a virus, that end is changed genetically. We'll come back to that. And this just shows, here's an undifferentiated B cell. It means it's a B cell. It hasn't met a foreign particle yet. Here's the new B cell. Okay, and yada, 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 down to make the protein that's going to recognize, say, chicken pox. So here are 3 different kinds of B cells, and this one is the one that recognizes chicken pox. So when you get chicken pox, when this one recognizes chicken pox, it reproduces itself. It reproduces itself, makes clones of itself. So what happens is this. This is when you got chicken pox. And it took about 7 days. Notice over here it says antibody concentration. You can say that's also concentration of B cells in your blood plasma. As after about 17 days or so, the concentration of antibodies peaks. What does that mean? Well, that means that now you have produced as many antibodies as you can against that virus. Notice then that it drops back down. Why? The virus is gone. Here is the second time you got exposed to the virus. Notice how fast the secondary response is. That is because notice that this number didn't go back to 0. You have what are called memory cells that hang around and wait for the virus to come back again. Notice in the same organism, they gave it a virus of a different nature, and notice that even though it reacted to this virus, virus A, very quickly, it took the same amount of time to react to virus B as it did originally. This is not in your book, but I would highly recommend you know this slide. There are 2 basic responses then to a virus or bacteria, a new antigen getting into your body. Okay? You have the humoral response, which means that free antigens are swimming around in your lymph or your blood. They activate B cells. B cells clone themselves to make memory cells, and they secrete those things called antibodies, which are going to grab on and get rid of viruses. Notice that it says they defend against extracellular pathogens. The cell-mediated response. Antigens displayed by infected cells. Remember, we just talked about that with the MHC molecule. Activate cells that will kill them. Cytotoxic T cells will kill them. Cytotoxic T cells also make memory cells. The other cell that's involved is something called a helper T cell. Helper T cells produce chemicals that stimulate the reproduction of these. So there are 3 kinds of cell involved in immunity. Helper T cells, well, 3 kinds of cells in acquired immunity. Helper T, cytotoxic T, and B cells. Notice, helper T cells recognize, again, it becomes an antigen-presenting cell. In other words, a white blood cell that has eaten a virus or bacteria and presents it on its surface using those MHC molecules we talked about before. The second time you get the antigen, you have all these, quote, memory cells around to help you get rid of it faster. So that's an overview of how your body reacts to a virus or bacteria. So, one of the interesting things about your immune system then is that because it can distinguish self from non-self, it's hard to transplant things. Okay? Transplanted tissues are normally destroyed by your immune system. Let's go look at blood group for an example. Blood cells have on their surface either A antigens, B antigens, A and B antigens, or no antigens. So this would be A, B, O. The problem is that A then produces anti-B, antibodies. So if you try to put B blood into A, death. B produces anti-A. AB produces none. O produces both. So if we look at the next chart, table 43.1 in your book, you see that type A, you can give recipient's blood group. Presence or absence of transfusion reaction. This means you cannot, if it's a plus, you can't, this is the opposite. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't put B into A. Why? Because it produces anti-B antibodies. Don't put AB into A. Same reason, you got this. O, notice, can go into anybody. That makes O the universal donor. Notice AB has no reaction across this way. That makes AB the universal recipient. They can receive blood from anybody. There's also something called the RH factor, which makes people either positive or negative. Okay, so on your blood cell, you can have an A antigen and a RH plus antigen. If somebody is RH negative, so let's say mom is O negative, that's what her blood cell would look like. That means she produces anti-positive antibodies. So when she has a positive fetus, there could be a problem. The other molecule that's involved are those MHC molecules. So when they look at matching for organ transplants, they actually are looking at MHC molecules, not just blood type. And that's all the more you need to know on that. There are some kinds of diseases, and we're going to do this very briefly, that have either exaggerated immune response or diminished immune response. And so we have things like allergies, which is an exaggerated response to antigens that are usually harmless. They're not pathogens. You can get localized allergies, and you can get other kinds of allergies. We're not going to go into any detail on that, but just know it's a hyper-exaggerated response to a harmless antigen. There are autoimmune diseases where, for some reason, the immune system loses tolerance for self and attacks certain molecules of the body. And there are a lot of different kinds of these. Rheumatoid arthritis is one. It's called autoimmune. Attack self. Here are some other examples of autoimmune diseases. We think that one is. Immunodeficiency diseases. Okay? Immunodeficiency means your immune system is not working, we're going to skip ahead to acquired immune deficiency disease, or AIDS. Okay? People with AIDS die of infections and cancers that take advantage of an immune system in collapse. What AIDS virus does is attacks helper T cells. Helper T cells. And so the immunodeficiency virus attacks helper T cells, which it disables the immune response. And this is just a picture of AIDS viruses here around a T cell. So we'll talk more about this in class a little bit, and feel free to look up animations of how HIV works. But HIV infects helper T cells. And remember from the slide previously, it's helper T cells that assist in cloning B and T cells to take care of viruses and bacteria. That's a very brief overview of the immune system.